I have turned the recorder on. Okay. I have a few of them I got to go and re-preach to the recorder, re-teach to the recorder so that they're all recorded. But I'm going to try to do one from the Thanksgiving break there. A couple days off work. So this one is being recorded. All right. My 6 reminder people have worked. I'm too much a creature of habit. Until I do it 100 times, I probably won't get into the habit of it. So, good morning, everyone. We're going to start with the book of Leviticus. So, getting right into it, we're going to start with our memory verse and look at... I'm going to turn my other device on here, my pointer. Please work. Okay. So, Leviticus 11:44, memory verse, and it's kind of similar to like Leviticus 19:2, the very familiar verse. Everybody, it's quoted in the New Testament over and over. Be holy, for I am holy. This is a similar one, right? It says, "For I am the Lord your God," and you need to consecrate or separate yourself. So the idea of holiness, and the reason I picked this verse is because of that word consecrate, right? We need to think of ourselves as being separated from the world, pulled out of the world, rescued from the world. And we have a life that's separate from the world, and that separation is separated out of the world, but then devoted to God. Like the idea of consecration, separation, and holiness is really the primary idea is that we are devoted to God. Our lives are aimed in the direction of service to God. And so that's true for Israel. It's true for us because the idea of holiness is applicable to New Testament saints, as the New Testament makes very clear by quoting from Leviticus. So that believers are really dedicated, consecrated, and separated into service for God. And so that's why I picked this verse, right? So be holy, for I am holy, and you shall not make yourselves unclean with any of the swarming things that swarm on the earth. And that idea of cleanness and uncleanness, again, has the idea of our service has in mind that we are to really arrange our lives and renew our thinking, like a Romans 12:2 thinking, right? Be renewed in the thinking, right? So that we're transformed by the renewing of your mind, is that we're thinking about things that are clean and not unclean. We're thinking, right, like Philippians would say, whatsoever things are clean and pure and right, think on these things, right? This is the same idea, but a physical representation of them by the way that they had to separate from their culture, their world. A lot of the dietary, ceremonial parts of Leviticus are put in there for the reason and the idea that they are transforming themselves by the renewing of their mind, by separating from what is unclean and devoting themselves to what is clean. And really the law is designed as a teaching method to teach and instruct that. Even the ceremonial parts, even the dietary parts, the clothing parts, the custom parts, those are all designed to be in the direction of getting themselves out of the world and getting themselves into service for the Lord and dedicating themselves for that purpose. So it really is all-encompassing because God says clean out every area of your life, right? We're coming out of the world with baggage and garbage that we need to be cleaning out all the time, and so Leviticus really serves the purpose of seeing, well, how far do I have to go? Pretty overwhelmingly far. If you try to keep a version of this law for yourself, you'll never get there. Only by the mercy of God did he let them continue, right? There's an element of law, there's an element of mercy, even in the Aaronic priesthood and even in the law, Mosaic law covenant, right? Without God's mercy, you never get there, and we'll see that. So the idea of consecrating, separating, devoting yourself into service for the Lord. So that's why I picked this verse as kind of maybe more all-encompassing of what the real idea is in Leviticus. Going into the overall structure and theme of the books, you kind of have 2 parts to the book. The whole idea of the book is, I like that word, how to approach God, right? God is setting up acceptable approach to a holy God. How a sinful man can acceptably approach a holy man, a holy God, right? There's a disconnect in our lives, in our sinfulness, that says we can't approach God as we are in our sinfulness. We can only approach God understanding His holiness and His mercy. And really the law is meant to teach us that God is a merciful God and allowing us to approach, but never forgetting His holiness. Right? The whole law is that set up in this way. You always keep in mind that God is a holy God. Never forget. Never take His mercy for granted and say it doesn't matter. God is holy and right, and we are never able to approach Him without Him providing access. Okay? We would never be able to approach God unless He provides access, which ultimately He does in His Son, Jesus Christ. And the sacrificial system, which he starts out saying, you need to understand the importance of sacrifice as a way of approaching God, because ultimately that's a picture of the sacrifice of Christ to come. So you have all these sacrifices that say you need to understand the seriousness approach, and all this sacrificial system has and builds into it is a way of saying you need blood, right? The shedding of blood for the remission of sins in order to approach a holy God. God has provided that picture in the sacrificial system. And so they're never really that far away from one sacrifice or another in their lives, in their daily lives, forgetting the fact that without this we can't approach God. Right? The whole tent of meeting tabernacle system exists to show that there is a real need to remember that we're approaching a holy God and He is separated from us. In fact, we ended, and that's where I'm going to pick up, we ended on Mount Sinai, so the location and place of the writing of the book of Leviticus is right where Exodus left us. They were getting ready to leave Mount Sinai, and then they couldn't because they failed with the golden calf. Remember, the two main events of Exodus drive our understanding of the book of Leviticus in this way. God approached them on the mountain and they were terrified, and they should be, because God is a holy God. God was instructing them with the Ten Commandments and the instructions of the law in order to get ready to leave Mount Sinai. But before they could, they sinned against God by creating the golden calf, where God said, we got to stop this whole thing, and now we got to be re-instructed in order to leave together, because otherwise you're all dead, right? God was ready to wipe out the whole nation of Israel and start again with Moses. And so they had to be re-instructed, and God said, now I'm going to exist in a tent outside the congregation, and you're going to see a separation between me and you, and now you're going to understand what it means to travel with a holy God and how to exist, and then as we go along the way, and then also what it means when we get into the land, right? So this will continue as you get into the land. But we can't even leave Mount Sinai until you understand all of this. So this book was written and instructed to them in about a month. 40 days Moses was on that mountain, right? And so then those 40 days, these laws were communicated about acceptable approach to God. So the main outline of the book is the sacrifice that's necessary to approach God, and then the personal and corporate sanctification or consecration, separating ourselves idea. Sanctification is a process of becoming like God, learning to be like God, learning to be holy like He is holy, so that we maintain our approach to God. And our approach to God is described in this way. You have fellowship with God. Right? God says there's an acceptable way to fellowship with me, even in the Old Testament. And then there are ways in which you understand when that fellowship is broken. He really brings that out in the idea of being clean and unclean. And you'll see that theme in the book of Leviticus. And so when you're clean, it doesn't mean that you're sinless. It means that you have acceptable approach to God. You've maintained your fellowship by sacrificing and understanding the mercy of God and allowing that approach. You've sinned and you haven't repented and you haven't made it right, you are unclean or you are out of fellowship with God. And then there are visual reminders of clean and unclean with open scabs and leprosy, and there are pictures of childbirth, and there are things that are pictured as unclean, dead bodies and other things that say, just so you understand, these things are not a picture of life but death. And so when you experience these things, you have to have a time of uncleanness in order to come and approach God again. You have to maintain a separation in order to come back in. right? So and that's a reminder of the holiness of God, and the fact that no matter what we do, we're always going to have a measure of uncleanness that God has to remind us about, that we need to deal with in order to reset and approach a holy God. It's always about renewing your mind and these visual pictures are really just a way for God to illustrate those points. They're never far from an illustration about God's holiness. So we have it broken down into, we're going to cover each one of these points here of the approach to God, with the sacrifice and the laws of the priests and the purity, personal and corporate purity, and then we get to the middle point of the book, which is really chapter 16 and 17. The middle point is the most important part. That's the Day of Atonement. So he's teaching about the sacrificial system, and then you're kind of looking at it going, yeah, but there's no way that's ever going to work. He says, you're right, you need a Day of Atonement, and we'll get there. Then when you say, okay, now at least I understand that God's going to make a way, even though we can't keep all this, he's going to make a way. And then he goes in and he describes kind of the national setup, how are we going to live together, and how are you going to live with your fellow brother and sister in this nation. And it kind of breaks down into more of a, as we're traveling along the way, right? Now that you understand, let's kind of spell it out and apply it. So any questions, feel free to stop and ask. I know we haven't gotten into verse 1 yet, but I'm just trying to get a setup where you understand the structure of the book.
Yeah, a lot of the talk, that was a yearly, right? That
was every year, okay. Yep. It was one of their national days that he'll describe about here in chapter 23 and 24. It's the middle point of the whole book. So in Jewish writing, I won't get too far into this so you can look into it yourselves. They write in times of what's called a chiasm, and you may have heard that in some of our leader studies before. It's a way of kind of illustrating to get to the point, and the most important point being in the middle. It's kind of a V shape in your writing if you're doing like an outline, right? So you start out on the outside of the end of the book and the beginning of the book. They're kind of paralleled. Then you get to the middle sections of the book, and they're kind of paralleled. And then you get to the middle point of the book. That's the main point. So only that to say that it is written in a chiasm. It's written in that way so that the ends of the books are kind of paralleled, the middle points of the books are kind of paralleled, and the most important part right in the middle is the Day of Atonement. And so the Day of Atonement is in that way the most important part. Now, I don't think that you need to look at that any further than that, except I think the most important part is to know that's the middle. Don't worry about the parallel points at the beginning and the end. We're going to go through in a linear fashion and just deal with the book because I think it's easier to understand that way. But a lot of Hebrew poetry, a lot of Hebrew writing is in that form of a chiasm, but that's as much as you need to know. So that's the outline of the book. It really breaks down the two parts, sacrifice and sanctification. The way to God, or the way of approach to God, and then how do I continue to walk with the Lord. And that's kind of the two-part of the book, with the Day of Atonement being in the middle. Now, getting into the laws of approach to God, it starts out with chapter 1 and verse 1, where Yahweh called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. That's where we ended on in Exodus. God went out to the tent, and whenever Moses would go out, the people would stand and listen. And so now God calls to Moses from the tent. His presence is there. And he says, "Speak to the sons of Israel," verse 2, "and say to them, when any man from among you brings an offering near to Yahweh, you shall bring your offering of animals from the herd or the flock." So he begins to describe now an approach to God through sacrifice, and the sacrifice of animals and the shedding of blood. And so the whole system of approach to God is going to be set up by a sacrificial system, of which there are five main sacrifices that you have to understand. 5 main sacrifices in this system. Okay? And so the 5 main sacrifices are going to be described as the burnt offering, the meal offering, the peace offering, and then there's a sin offering and a trespass offering. Use a different word, but they're both sin offerings, but there's a sin offering and a trespass offering. We'll get to the difference in them. Also, the burnt offering is a sin offering, but now to kind of give you a little way to understand the 5 sacrifices. Okay, so the first one there, is in verse 3. Yeah.
It's minor, but so when he calls to Moses, is this now kind of like the one-on-one kind of discussion?
Moses goes to the tent and he goes in to talk to God.
Like the people around.
I don't think they're listening. Yeah, they know. Because then he says, go back and say to the sons of Israel. So he's teaching Moses. This is recorded.
They had their one where they...
Speaking to him as a friend.
Yeah, but they spoke to the people.
Yeah.
And that was too much for him, so now it's just this personal one-on-one kind of...
Correct. Moses has to go and speak to us yourself and do not let God speak to us because we're terrified. Yeah. And we know that we'll die if he does it. So even that degree of separation sets up and is understandable in this whole system, right? God has separated himself because he's holy, and he says, now you have to understand this way of approach. It starts with, you need to know about this burnt offering. Okay? So the burnt offering is a way of approaching God when you are in fellowship or you are clean. You are in the clean status. Okay? So God says, you want to approach God, you start off with this burnt offering in verse 3. It's a burnt offering from the herd. You're going to bring it near. It's a male without blemish. You're going to bring it. They're going to lay his hand on it. You lay your hand on it, right? You identify with this animal. And this allows you in good fellowship to approach God. I'm still a sinner, but I'm in good status because I understand my sinfulness. I lay my sinfulness into this animal in order to approach God. I transfer my sinfulness, in a sense, this temporary transfer, into the animal. I identify that the shedding of blood is needed to approach God. And so in good fellowship, I approach God. That's needed when you're in good fellowship. Okay? So your sinfulness is never forgotten. Your sinfulness is always reminded that every time I want to approach God, I need to have this burnt offering to come and approach God because I'm a sinner and I need God to overlook that and to be in good fellowship with him. So I recognize I can be in good fellowship with God and he's merciful, but I also recognize it needs sacrifice in order to approach him. And so the burnt offering is a sin offering in this way. It's the sin nature offering. It's the sin nature offering. I have a sin nature, and Jesus hasn't come yet, and I need this sacrifice in order to approach God in good fellowship. Okay, the second one then comes out, and again, stop with questions. Chapter 2, verse 1, it describes if anyone brings near a grain offering, and so you have a grain offering with God, and this grain offering can be of fine flour and oil and frankincense. You're going to bring it to Aaron in verse 2, and they're going to take it, and they have a way of taking a handful of it and putting it, and the priest shall offer it up in the smoke, and a portion of it on the altar. And so this is a way of maintaining, this is another good fellowship. I'm in good standing with God, and I have an attitude of gratitude. I'm thankful for this, and I can offer these offerings up as a part of my thanksgiving to God. And so this is another good fellowship status offering that's an approach. God provides. I see God's provision and blessing, and I respond this way by I offer these thanksgiving sacrifices. And again, the same with the peace offering, right? And so you have a third sacrifice that says in chapter 3 and verse 1, now if his offering is a sacrifice of peace offering, he's going to bring near one from the herd, male or female, shall bring it near without blemish before Yahweh. So you have this peace offering that says, I'm glad I have peace with God. I recognize that it's undeserved. And I offer up this peace offering with God to say, I want to maintain this good standing of fellowship with God, and I recognize it in a gratitude of sacrifice of an animal. And so this is a recognition of the gratitude for the maintaining fellowship with God. I've maintained fellowship with God, and I'm glad for it, and I offer up peace offering, recognizing that I have a continuing fellowship and a relationship with God of peace. He's not angry. And he's allowing my approach. And so this is kind of a continual offering. So those three offerings together, the first three, the burnt offering, the grain offering, the peace offering, are offerings that you offer in recognition that I have acceptable approach to God, and he has allowed this, and I'm glad, and I'm grateful, and I'm thankful. And so I, out of that gratitude and thankfulness to God, maintain these offerings. Okay, now we get to the two sin offerings. Here's what you have to do when you break fellowship with God. and you break fellowship with God by sinning. Sin puts distance between you and God. You become unclean, unacceptable approach in the pictures of Leviticus, right? And so now you have two sin offerings, and the first one is found in chapter 4. Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, if a person sins unintentionally." So here's the thing. I'm looking at my life. I realize I can look back and see ways that I've sinned, and I said, wow, that's not acceptable to God. I need to deal with that myself by repenting. And just between me and God, I need to get back on track. And so I take this sin offering in an attitude of restoring fellowship with God. I know by myself I'm convicted about my sin and I need to deal with it. And so I restore fellowship with God by bringing this unintentional sinning offering. What unintentional means is that I've been self-convicted and I know it and I want to deal with it. And so I go in repentance, I offer up this sin offering. So that's chapter 4. That's your fourth way of approach to God. When I know myself, I see my own sin, and I know I better not go to God until I deal with it. I better bring this offering. Right? I'm self-convicted about this through the Holy Spirit, and I know I got to deal with it. And so this is my own personal approach to God dealing with it with a sin offering. That's the fourth one. Now, after I explain the fifth one, we'll see if there are any questions. The fifth one, chapter 5. And there you have, as it says, now if a person sins after he hears a public oath to testify. So this is, somebody had to come and tell you that you were sinning. Okay? So now we have in the public arena of the nation of Israel, between brothers and sisters who are following God, somebody has to come to me and say, you sinned and created an offense. Oh my goodness, it's been brought to my attention with public testimony. I better recognize that and do something about it. And so I recognize that that person is right and that I want to maintain my fellowship with the assembly of God, and I want to maintain my fellowship with God. And so in chapter 5, I have to offer this trespass. I have trespassed against another brother or sister in the matter, and it was brought to public attention. And now I need to restore not only my fellowship with God, but with my brothers and sisters. And so I have to publicly bring this Leviticus chapter 5 trespass offering. So now I have restored my fellowship with God and with my brothers and sisters, because that trespass against another brother or sister has been forgiven. It's been recognized and dealt with. Okay? So let that sink in, right? So these are the 5 offerings that kind of maintain the sacrificial system with Israel about acceptable approach to God. And I say fellowship. I kind of use the terms interchangeably. Approach means I have maintained my fellowship with the Lord. Right? Just like a New Testament Christian, we know that we're not perfect. We know that even though we've been forgiven, we're going to sin. The sacrificial system recognizes that too. They're to approach God and be holy like He is holy. But knowing that can't ever be the perfect case, I have this system to remind me about how to maintain approach to God. All this is instructive to point to the fact that they really need a new covenant. This old covenant can't really accomplish what God says it needs to accomplish. So the old covenant, the law portion of the covenant, was never meant to be perfect. It was never meant to be 100% maintainable. It was meant to set up a system to remind you that you needed to keep at it, but at the same time you could never do it. And at the same time, I need a new covenant, and I need a mediator of that new covenant, Jesus Christ, or this whole system really doesn't work. Okay? So you're a busy little Jewish person maintaining all these sacrifices all the time, and maintaining your fellowship all the time, and loving my neighbor all the time, and making sure I don't trespass all the time, and trying to stay in good fellowship and standing with my brother and my sister and my neighbor and with God. And so that's the sacrificial system in the first 5 chapters of Leviticus. We're going to need 2 weeks.
I was just curious if the Orthodox Jews follow this in some way. I don't know much about them.
Modern day Jews claim to follow the Torah, but as of today, there is not one sacrificial system that I know of.
Okay.
So no.
So For some reason, I've got the view that the priests were the ones that were doing all the sacrificing. But if you read this, the person is the one that actually does the slaughtering.
A lot of them.
You're getting up close and this
At the very least, you're there and you're putting your hands on that animal when it's being done, right? So you're not setting it there and leaving. You're staying there for the slaughter of that animal.
Involved.
Yeah, you're very involved. Remember, the transferring ideas, the laying on of hands of that animal is to say, I recognize that this death is forestalling, giving me a measure of grace to continue here, right? It's not absolute forgiveness, but it's a measure of forgiveness, looking forward to Christ. But I have to put my hands on that animal as it's being killed to say, I understand that death gives me continuing fellowship. Right? So that's the idea of being right there and placing your hands on it is saying, I know I need this. Yeah. So it was a bloody system.
My dad, years ago, he worked at the high-grade packing house.
Yeah.
And he saw that going on.
Yes.
And the rabbis come in and he saw that.
Because they do kosher packaging, and
He actually saw that.
Yeah.
I never asked him how long he
Is that
worked
for
there.
the individual? Each individual brings it, or for a family?
There are certain, it's individual. It's individual. So a part of it is that, let me say it this way, it sounds like we're going to need a lot of animals to get this thing going, right? So we'll take this week to set up for next week. But it needs a lot of animals to keep this thing going. When we get to the end of the book, God says, that's okay because I'm going to give you a lot of animals by blessing you. I'm going to give you enough animals to keep this thing going, and you're going to have more than enough because I'm going to bless you so that not only you guys are never going to starve, you're going to have more than enough, right? That's how you're going to know. If you're willing to maintain this thing, I'm willing to supply the animals, God says. Okay? So, in fact, because the animals, again, are just they're an instrument of God to teach and instruct. And so God says, you need the animals. So it'd be a really crummy thing if we ran out of animals to sacrifice. What does that mean about God's side of providing, right? So you know that you're in good standing if God is blessing and you have enough animals and more than enough and we're being fed and we're being blessed. And so I know that the fellowship side is maintained and God's going to provide all these for us, right? So it is, though, it's a very, again, necessary. Yeah, we need animals. We can't, you're not a vegetarian society because you're going to be eating a lot of meat.
Maybe you'll talk about this more, but like these animals that they're sacrificing, like weren't they supposed to be like the creme de la creme, like the best of their...
Perfect and unblemished.
And then also... like they couldn't eat the meat or anything from these animals.
Some of it they could.
Oh, okay.
So it depends on the sacrifice, and it depends. Like the sin offerings, generally you couldn't because that thing needed to be killed and consumed on your behalf. So you don't get any benefit from that.
Yeah.
But the other offering, like the burnt offering, other ones you can because you're maintaining your fellowship, and a lot of it. Remember, a lot of the sacrifices, the meat goes to the priest and takes care of them. They eat from it. They make the bread and they eat from it, and they get the grain offerings and and vegetables and other things they get from Israel, and they basically, that's the way their tax system worked, is that a lot of the offering system was meant to provide for the Levites because they didn't have.
But aren't they not allowed to eat the fat?
Correct.
Okay.
They don't eat the fat. They don't eat portions of it. They have to bury parts of it, burn parts of it, keep parts of it for themselves, and then give parts of it to the priest. And so when you see all that detail, you're going, boy, that's a lot to work out. You better know you better have a butcher's mind to know how I'm going to cut this thing up, right? Because what if they have to know what part of the kidneys and what part of the meat, what part of the fat, what part of, they knew all that, right? So that a lot of the system was designed that it was eaten portions of it, and it was to give to the priest portions of it to take care of them.
Okay.
Oh, then did they call that kosher then? Kosher, blessed by the rabbi, or kosher?
They didn't have kosher back then. They didn't think of the word.
Oh, okay.
It wasn't a part of the system until later when they decided to identify it as. Probably as they lost contact with the temple and everything else, they had to figure out how do we maintain an evidence of that it doesn't have blood in it, and so forth, right? When they're in the temple, it don't matter. If it came from the temple, it was kosher. So that's a more modern word, but it's trying to follow the same idea.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to continue. Stop with questions. So you get into chapter 6, and as you get into chapter 6, now all the details, like Betsy, you were saying, how do we figure out what to do with these things as they're being sacrificed? Chapter 6 and 7 really go about, it says, now command Aaron and his sons, saying, this is the law for the burnt offerings. Now the priests, how are you going to handle it when all these people are bringing these animals in? So chapter 6 and 7 are kind of a rehearsal or looking at these same 5 sacrifices again. How are the priests supposed to handle it as all this stuff is coming in? And so that's what you get in chapter 6 in verse 9. Right? This is the law for the burnt offering. The burnt offering itself shall remain on the hearth on the altar all night until morning, and on the fire on the altar and is to be kept burning. You just consume the thing, you burn it to blackness, you burn it to a crisp. Well done. Okay? So you get the instructions for each one. Then you get into chapter 6 in verse 25. And Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, speak to Aaron, to his son, saying, this is the law of the sin offering. In the place where the burnt offering is slaughtered, the sin offering shall be slaughtered before Yahweh. It is most holy. There's the idea, this is one you don't touch. The priest who offers it for sin shall eat it. That's it. Shall be eaten in the holy place. You have to eat it right there and then. You don't get to take it home. You know, so there's a whole portion of how the priest handles it. Anyone touches its flesh will be set apart as holy. Whenever of its blood is sprinkled on a garment in the holy place, you shall wash what was sprinkled. So you have this whole kind of thing of it. Only priests can eat that one, right? And then it's eaten right there and it can't be taken out. The rest of it has to be burned with fire. Whatever you can eat while you're there, that's it. It doesn't leave. So you have, again, all these instructions about how each offering, and part of it, each one has a little bit of symbolism about what they're approaching God. Sin offering, you're supposed, again, you don't take anything home with you because you're really dealing with your sin and repentance, and that's good enough. So you have chapter 6, verse 25, kind of again, I didn't have them in the right order. So chapter 14, the grain offering has its way of dealing with it, right? The grain offering comes before him in chapter 6, verse 14. You raise up, it says, then one of them is going to raise up a handful of the fine flour of the grain offering and its oil and its frankincense that is on the grain offering. Offer it up in smoke on the altar as a soothing aroma. Here's the picture of that, is that this thanksgiving goes up and the smell of it goes up to God, and He smells and He's pleased by it. So you have this whole picture of that in the grain offering. See if they go in the right order here. Yeah, okay. Chapter 7, verse 1. This is the law of the guilt offering. And so when you get there, in the holy place where they slaughter the burnt offering, there to slaughter the guilt offering and splash the blood around on the altar. Bring it near from all. Then he shall bring near from it all of its fat, fat tail, the fat covers, the entrails, the 2 kidneys, the fat on them, which is on the loins, the lobe of the liver, remove it from the kidneys, and the priest shall offer them up in smoke on the altar as an offering by fire. It's guilt offering, and every male in the priests may eat of it. So now and it shall be eaten in the holy place. Again, it doesn't leave. So you have this whole process, again, that kind of gives all the details about the offerings, and it goes this way in chapter 7 and verse 11. As it says about the peace offering there, this is the law of the sacrifice of the peace offering, which shall be brought near to Yahweh. Right? If he brings it near for thanksgiving, then along with the sacrifice of thanksgiving, he shall bring it near unleavened cakes mixed with oil, unleavened wafers with oil, cakes of well-stirred flour mixed with oil, with the sacrifice of his peace offering for thanksgiving he shall bring it. Verse 14, he shall bring it near one of every offering as a contribution to Yahweh. It shall belong to the priest who splashes the blood. So they get bread. You see they're getting more provision out of this one. If you can bring bread and other things with this one, an offering to thanksgiving, and then you leave it for the priests. So they get to eat. This is what they can take with them and for their provisions. So each one of them kind of has those flavors just to give that idea about what it's all about, right? So you have to kind of delineate each one. Who gets to take what? Do they have to eat it right there? Can they take it back with them? You know, those kind of ideas, right? So that's how it goes through from chapter 7, the rehearsing of all the offerings and what the priests have to do and who gets what and what has to stay and what has to be burnt and what can't leave. And, so you have all those details in chapter 7. And then the summary of it kind of fits at the end, where in verse 37, he kind of gives this little summary. This is the law of the burnt offering, the grain offering, the sin offering, and the guilt offering, and the ordination offering, and the sacrifice of peace offering, which Yahweh commanded Moses at Mount Sinai the day that he commanded the sons of Israel to bring their offerings near to Yahweh in the wilderness of Sinai. So they haven't left. This is just all the instruction to get ready for their leaving. We can't leave until you guys know how to deal with all this. And so that's your summary of all the sacrifice, the first 7 chapters. This kind of gives you that last summary statement. So we get into the priests. The next section goes into the laws of the priests. So once you understand the sacrificial system and what it's all about, now Yahweh is going to prepare the Aaronic priesthood. And this is, he goes, you and your sons, you need to understand all of these things. Otherwise, we can't, how are you going to manage these people? How are you going to help and mediate in their approach to God? This is how it goes. Yahweh spoke to Moses in chapter 8 and verse 1, saying, Take Aaron and his sons with him, and the garments, and the anointing oil, and the bull of the sin offering, and the 2 rams, and the basket of unleavened bread, and assemble all the congregation at the doorway of the tent of meeting. So Moses did, just as Yahweh commanded him. So they set up this whole avenue of we're going to have a ceremony to dedicate Aaron and his sons as our priests, and so they do, and and they give all the instructions for it, and he gives all this preparation of consecration and set apart and washing and everything that Aaron and his sons have to do and the garments that they have to wear, and everything starts to get spelled out. Chapter 9, it goes this way. It came about on the 8th day that Moses called Aaron and his sons and the elders of Israel, saying, Take for yourselves the calf, the bull, the sin offering, the ram, the burnt offering, without blemish, and bring them before Yahweh. Then to the sons of Israel you shall speak, saying, Take a male goat for a sin offering, and a calf and a lamb, and both 1 year without blemish. So Aaron and his sons are dedicating this offering and preparing themselves and setting themselves apart for the priesthood, while the people are out offering sacrifices and the expectation of this priesthood being dedicated. They're preparing themselves to receive this priesthood. We have to accept this priesthood and this mediation that Aaron is going to perform for us. And so you have all the assembly of Israel preparing and dedicating themselves. And in verse 6 it says, This is the thing which Yahweh has commanded you to do, that the glory of Yahweh may appear to you. Right? So it's a real serious event. Of setting apart and setting this priesthood. The priests are not good enough to be priests. They're sinful just like the people they're mediating for. They have to be extra set apart and dedicated to this task, and they have to take it real serious. And so everybody gets a sense of the awe of God, and God says, I can't even approach until you have these mediators in place and set up and working for you to do this service of the sacrifice in order for you to approach. So make sure you understand the significance and the importance of these priests and their role in your society and in your worship, because without them, even if you do all they need to be in place for you to approach me. And so God takes a few chapters and he sets up all the ceremony, and he sets up all of the washing and the clothing and the preparation time in order to dedicate the priests. And so in chapter 9 and verse 22, it says, And Aaron lifted up his hands toward the people and blessed them. And he stepped down after offering the sin offering, the burnt offering, the peace offering, and Moses and Aaron went into the tent of meeting. So to inaugurate this whole thing, Moses and Aaron, all the sacrifice for sin, all the sacrifice for acceptable approach are done. Even to start this whole thing, Moses and Aaron go into the tent. And it says, They came and they blessed the people, and the glory of Yahweh appeared to all the people. Then fire came out from before Yahweh in verse 24 and consumed the burnt offering and the portions of the fat on the altar. And all the people saw it and shouted and fell on their faces. So this is the starting ceremony, right? Like anything else, the Olympics, anything else, you have the big pomp and circumstance and everything else. Well, God invented it. And so he starts off this whole thing with a giant ceremony to say, we're going to dedicate the priesthood. Aaron goes in and says, I want you to bless the people and accept this system that we're setting up. God signifies his acceptance by sending fire down from heaven and barbecuing the whole thing. And he burns it up. And so they see that, and they bow in awe and reverence to God and worship. So they see this, the starting of this whole system takes place here in chapter 9. So we're only into chapter 9. So this is all just to explain all the detail, all the instruction, all the importance, all the significance of just getting started. And then in chapter 9 they start it. And so they start this whole system up. And that's what takes place in chapter 9. Then you get to the problem. Chapter 10. Nadab and Abihu had a great idea. It says Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took their respective fire pans and put fire in them. Then they placed incense on it and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. The real important part, what was the strange fire? Who cares? The Lord did not command it. The important part was they were doing something that was in violation of the very strict and precise way God wanted them to mediate for the people. Well, we got our own ideas about how to do that. God said, that's a bad idea. Don't have your own ideas. Don't do it. Right? You have your own idea, then you're running around thinking you can do things without me, which is in violation of this whole plan. You need God, or it ain't going to work. Don't do it against his commandment. And so they do. And fire came out from the presence of Yahweh and consumed them, and they died before Yahweh. Right? So you have this whole warning, right? Visual warning. God can come down and throw fire and accept your sacrifice. God can come down and throw fire and reject it. If the fire hits the sacrifice, you're okay. If the fire comes down on you, you are not okay.
I'm sorry, but what did they do wrong?
It says they lit strange fire. They have little pans of incense, little fire pans of incense, and they just did it in a way that was not according to the instructions of God. It says they lit strange fire before the Lord. In a sense, they were acting autonomously and just doing it on their own. So they were burning incense, sweet-smelling frankincense, who knows what it was. They were offering up a form of worship that was not according to the instruction, the 9 chapters of instructions that we just went about and did.
How were they supposed to have done it?
Not at all.
They weren't supposed to light it?
Correct.
Because God was going to light it?
No. This was just not a prescribed place, time, or method to be doing it.
And they knew.
Right.
They should have known.
Right.
This is not like they didn't know.
Right. Somebody comes up with a sacrifice. This is how you do it. This is how you can do it. They're going, yeah, I'm going to do my own thing over here. Not the right place, not the right time, not the right method. And so they said, it's the main idea here is they did something that was outside of the prescription of God on their own autonomously. So, yeah.
I noticed though there's not even a sacrifice there.
Correct.
Like they're just going off on their own.
Yeah, this is the Old Testament version of Ananias and Sapphira, right? So if you go to Acts chapter 7, but you get there and you see, so this is the version of God just saying, I've just spent so much time giving you some careful instructions, then you go ahead and do your own thing, and I got to show that that's not okay. And so he does. And so Aaron's 2 sons die. Now, here's what God says in verse 3. Moses said to Aaron, it is what Yahweh already told us. We already knew this. This is what Yahweh already spoke to us, saying, by those who come near me, I will be treated as holy. And before all the people, I will be glorified. Whatever they did not treat God as holy, and they were not doing it to offer glory to God. Moses is telling them they had a different idea. So they were not treating God as holy, and they were not offering it up in glory to God. They were not seeking to give God the prominence and the importance in this thing. And so that's why God did it. Moses said, we don't need God to come down and tell us this. We already knew it. And so Moses is telling his brother about his 2 nephews who just died. What they did was they did not treat God as holy.
I am struck too, though, that last sentence, so Aaron therefore kept silent.
Yes.
I think it really just speaks volumes of the reverence that
Mm-hmm.
Aaron had for God. He seems to be putting God above his own children.
I think he's learned a few lessons here with the golden calf and with his nephews, or his own sons now, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, Aaron is learning about these things, absolutely. Remember, this is all just getting started. So, yeah, there's a lot of learning lessons in there. Now, it goes on and it talks about it, and we'll probably have to wrap with this, but in chapter 10 and verse 6, it says they had to carry them out, right? They had to come and carry them outside the camp. And in verse 6, Moses said to Aaron and to his sons, Eleazar and Ithamar, do not uncover your heads, do not tear your clothes, so that you will not die, and he will not become wrathful against all the congregation. But let your relatives and the whole house of Israel, they are going to weep over the burning which Yahweh has brought about. You shall not even go out from the doorway of the tent of meeting. Don't do it. See, so the warning here is this. As the dad, I'm sure he wants to go out and bury his children. He wants to grieve by tearing his clothes and cry out in anguish. But you have just consecrated yourselves in holiness to the Lord. And if you go near death, you're in trouble. You're going to violate that consecration. You're going to violate that setting apart. You may want to grieve like that, but you can't. You have to let the congregation handle this one for you. And you need to stay holy and consecrated before the Lord, Aaron and your sons. We need to maintain this priesthood and not go near death, which is unclean. And then the warning is, even if you do that, it's like agreeing or identifying with their sin, and you don't want to go near that either. Let the people take care of that. You stay holy before the Lord, and do not agree with their sinfulness by participation. You're in a dangerous place because you've just set yourself apart as holy, Aaron, as a priest, and you can't go near death, even the death of your sons. And now, as an example, before the people of treating God holy, you need to maintain this posture of holiness.
Seems like it's the opposite. In Christian churches, you're not supposed to cover your head.
Right.
And,
Right.
and when I go to church, I look around, I see people with caps on.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say nothing to them.
No. So the idea in the Old Testament, covering your head was an attitude of submission to God, right? And so even the priest had the cap, right?
Yeah.
And there was and then the picture of not having your head covered is general picture of authority, right? And the husband as the leader, in a sense, they say don't cover your head, but women sometimes cover your head as a picture of submission. It's a cultural picture, but certainly relevant here is the priest. Absolutely. And so it says in verse 10, we'll kind of get through this. It says there in verse 10, this is so as to, let me get there, so as to separate between the holy and the profane, between the clean and the unclean, and so as to instruct the sons of Israel in all the statutes which Yahweh has spoken to them through Moses. Why Aaron had to stay set apart, stay consecrated, stay in that picture of separation and holiness as a priest, why he couldn't participate, because this is instructive to the nation of Israel about treating God as holy. What is clean and unclean? They are unclean, you are clean. You cannot go near what is unclean. God declared them unclean in his judgment, and therefore as a priest you can't go near it. You need to make sure that Israel sees that picture very clearly. I understand your grief, but don't do it. That's what he's warning his brother. And so you notice this, is that through all of that, there's even kind of the little ditty at the end there about, how he has to go and you just lost your sons and you're going to go up and offer the sacrifice. And at the end of the chapter 10, there's kind of this warning about, you almost kind of made a mistake. And then Moses, he says, look, I just lost my sons. I think, he says, I'm going to paraphrase and then you can question me. But I think God will understand a little bit here. Little grace in this one. I just lost my sons. Moses says, okay. Right? So, even in all of that, the end of that, I think, is that God is merciful. Even if a little mistake, Aaron was still trying to stay set apart, holy. He was offering the sacrifices. Moses warns them to be careful, and I think Aaron says, yeah, I think God will have a little grace on this one. And Moses said, yeah, I agree. So, chapter 10 is a clear instruction there about the starting off of the sacrificial system and not treating it lightly, not treating it, right? Don't treat the approach to God lightly in any way. And sometimes we need to maintain that in our own New Testament perspective about worship before God, is that we don't want to take it lightly. We don't want to treat it profane or unclean. We'll get more into those ideas. The next section, we're going to deal with the idea of being clean and unclean. We'll have to pick that up next time and continue in Leviticus. Father, we thank you for this time of learning and instruction, and even a book with a bunch of commandments and laws that may seem difficult and repetitive at times. Hopefully, the big picture helps make it understood. And Lord, I pray that we would just see the grace and mercy that you give on us in allowing us to come boldly before your throne, and even the picture of the temple veil being torn in two at the death of Christ and providing that way of access for us. Let us not take it lightly and understand just how important that was, even in its symbolism, showing the grace and mercy, the fullness of the picture of grace and mercy which we get to display to a world today knowing Christ. We thank you for that. We thank you for your grace and mercy. In Jesus' name, amen.